Hi, I'm Steve Ross, and this is going to be hopefully a short, to the point, additional video on Kant and the categorical imperative. Um, Couple of points. Let me just say what I hope I can cover today. One is to say something about why the categorical imperative has the shape or structure that it does. Then I want to take up the first formulation of the categorical imperative, the universal law formulation, and what the problems with it are. Some of these problems are tied to the distinctive formulation there, and some of these problems I think are just tied to the overall structure of Kant's way of understanding moral judgment. And then we'll turn to the second formulation that I want to take up, which will be the never treat persons merely as means but always as ends in themselves formulation, and the limitations or inadequacies of that. I think both formulations suffer from a similar or common problem. It should be no surprise. Kant said himself there's only one categorical imperative, although there are different ways of getting at it, hence the different formulations. If there's a problem with the categorical imperative test, we should expect to see this problem in any formulation. And there is, and the problem in a nutshell, I think, is tied to Kant's general orientation that morality, the authority of morality, being tied to this capacity of persons to take up and obey the moral command, can have nothing to do with ends or states of affairs. It's not that we're not at all interested in outcomes in Kant. We're just interested in them in a particular way. I mean, I think we'll see this when we turn to the first formulation. But okay, just to repeat, why does the categorical imperative and the categorical imperative test have the distinctive content or structure that it has? I think the answer is tied to what Kant thinks of as lying in the center of the moral theory, which is the claim that persons have a certain kind of absolute value in virtue of this capacity they have to take up and obey the moral law. And Kant thinks that, therefore, the test of morality has to model or represent this rational capacity in some transparent way. He might not, in fact, have as tight an argument as he thinks in this regard, from the fact that this is an undeniably valuable feature of persons. It doesn't follow that the test of rightness can reflect and only reflect this feature of persons. But that's, I think, how Kant does argue. Given that this is what's of absolute value, this capacity, the test for rightness must reflect this capacity in persons generally. And if your maxim violates the CI test, it's somehow violative of this capacity and therefore immoral. All right, with that in mind, let's turn to the first formulation, which Kant puts as something like, act only such that your maxim could be willed as a universal law. I think he should have added, if you look at his discussion of the false promise keeping example, it's pretty clear he intends to add at the same time. Act only such that your maxim could at the same time be willed as a universal law. And the way to understand it, well, let's just rehearse the false promising example. You're in a certain situation where you need money, you're not able to pay it back. The only way you can get the money is to make a false promise that you will pay it back. Your maxim, I will make a false promise, is completely rational, given your circumstances, given your desire. We can speak of your maxim as a kind of rational, intentional plan of action. I think it's equally all right to think of it as convertible into a hypothetical imperative, given that you're in circumstances C with desire D. Do X is your hypothetical imperative. I will falsely promise. Perfectly reasonable, perfectly rational. As Kant himself says, while I can will the lie, I cannot will the universal will to lie. What does he mean by cannot will the universal will to lie? Well, he elucidates it in his own discussion. If you imagine this maxim as a universal law, it then becomes, and then ask yourself, could I have my subjective maxim against this background? The answer, Kant thinks, is no. It would be impossible for me to have this subjective maxim were it at the same time the universal law. I suppose we have to, following Kant's thought here, think that if this were a universal law and known to be a universal law, I couldn't even utter the words I promise without both of us breaking down in laughter, since we know that we're promising falsely. So what I want to stress about Kant's own treatment of this example is it's a point about possibility. The claim is not that if everyone were to lie, there'd be very unhappy consequences. If everyone were to lie, it would be a very sad and dangerous world. That's not it. It's not an appeal to outcome. It's not an appeal to unpleasant end states. We can't turn Kant into utilitarianism. It's a point about possibility, or if you will, possibility from a certain moral or rational point of view. It's not possible for you to have this subjective maxim if we also imagine this maxim as a universal law. And that, Kant seems to suggest, tells us something about its immorality. It's violative of our rational autonomy. If it's a maxim that could not be held consistently with it being a universal law, then it's a maxim that violates our rational autonomy as human agents capable of setting our desires aside and acting on what is morally required. So that's the thought. But even if he's right about this particular example, I think it's pretty obvious this is an extremely incomplete and inadequate test. There are many maxims which will pass this test and are otherwise objectionable. This, to me, is the crucial point, because after all, this isn't a test about the desirability or undesirability of the world that my maxim, were it a universal law, would bring about. This is a point about, if you will, compossibility, or I think in some ways it's simply a point about publicity. Is my maxim consistent with it being publicly known by all rational agents? In any event, you can think of maxims like, let's settle our disputes by dueling, and the maxim, I will never give anybody any aid whatsoever, and I don't expect any aid in return. If we imagine these as universal laws, it remains the case that it's possible to have them as subjective maxims at the same time. It hardly means that they're morally acceptable, but it does if the CI test is in fact the test that Kant describes it here to be, that all I have to make sure is that my maxim is one that I could at the same time will as a universal law. I think we shouldn't be surprised that many maxims of objectionable content will get through when the test itself has no interest in whether or not the content of the maxim brings about a world that we would find objectionable from the standpoint of utility or harm or welfare. This is just not the interest. The interest is simply whether it could be willed at the same time that it is a universal law. The test is deeply, I'm suggesting, impoverished from the start. So it's going to have what I'm calling a content problem, in that maxims will be able to pass this test and be objectionable on other grounds. I think that the dueling example illustrates this pretty well. So does what I'm calling the extreme libertarian example. Kant himself wrestles with that example. It's to his credit he brings it up, but I don't think he has a satisfactory solution. He says, I don't want to get bogged down in this because it just takes us other places. But he says things like, well, you couldn't in fact have this maxim that I'll never give anybody any money and not expect any in return. Even though it seems logically consistent, it's not pragmatically consistent because you might not know and you yourself might need this money. But I don't think he's entitled to make this appeal to some prudential interest of a future self that you don't, in fact, at this, we are imagining, happen to have. That's to appeal to interested ends and outcomes. This is something that, looking down the road, Rawls can make sense of under a veil of ignorance when you're being risk averse about possible futures and you're worrying about welfare, but from an impersonal point of view. But Kant has ruled out worry about welfare as beneath the purview of this, interest in that which has absolute value from a moral point of view. And this is why I think he's unable to rule this example out. And he's certainly unable to rule out the let's settle our disputes by dueling example. Another problem that Kant has is in the very structure of how we think of moral assessment and our maxims. Kant's are, even if you could fix the content problem, we have in such that presumably we somehow manage to get a better version of this test such that those maxims we think of as objectionable wouldn't pass. We still have a problem in that we don't have any clarity about whether or not our maxims may legitimately draw upon normative language and normative justification talk. Are we allowed to have in our understanding of a maxim something like, I'll lie, I will falsely promise if it is in the interest of justice. Yeah, something like that. Now, if we're allowed to use language like that, using normative language like if it's in the interest of justice, then of course my maxim will pass. But then all the work has been done in allowing normative language into the maxim in the first place. Kant, I think, is attuned to this and writes the groundwork as if maxims are social facts without any normative content at all. Normativity arises only when we take up the maxim from a suitably impersonal point of view and ask whether it could at the same time be a universal law. That's where the normative judgment lies. But then we're ruling out as even a possible maxim, a maxim which draws upon normative content. And this, I think, just does violation to actual moral agents. Think of their intentions. The resistance leader who's lying to the Nazi commandant does so because he thinks it's in the interest of justice to do so. If you leave out the appeal to the normative, end that he hopes to bring about, you don't do justice to what his actual maxim is. But if you allow normative language into maxim talk, then the fact that the maxim passes is guaranteed from the start. And this, I think, pushes us back to another point, not one Kant takes up, which is what we really argue about isn't whether our maxim passes a certain test, but whether your account of your maxim is the one that you're entitled to have. The dispute between Margaret Thatcher and the IRA isn't whether putting people in danger in the interest of justice is legitimate. The dispute is whether that's what the IRA is doing. Margaret Thatcher would say, you're just putting people in danger to satisfy an ancient grudge. And the IRA says, no, we're doing this because, the unification is a just cause. The question isn't whether the maxim passes a certain test, but whether it's true that the IRA has this maxim rather than another. The disputes, obviously, between, one group and another, one of which gets called the terrorist and which calls itself a freedom fighter, illustrates this perfectly. The question isn't whether the language of justification passes a certain test. The question is whether the agent is entitled to that language of justification. We have versions of this in our personal life all the time. I say, well, sure, if you really were criticizing me because you want me to be a better person, that would be fine. But I think you're doing it just because you feel good about yourself in doing so. I might say this to a colleague of mine who's criticizing my paper, something like this. We don't deny, that we pay this point the compliment of cloaking our maxims in the language of justification from the start all the time. The dispute isn't whether some or another maxim passes a test of morality. morality. The dispute is whether this is the correct description of the maxim that you actually have. But this issue is invisible to Kant, and there's no way to make it otherwise. For Kant's argument to work, maxims have to be understood as having nothing to do with normative justification talk. All the normativity arises only when we take up the moral point of view. But this, I think, does violence to the way in which we actually think of our intentions from the start. Okay, what about the second formulation? Always treat persons, yourself or others. I should have said never. Never treat persons, yourself or others, merely as means, but always as ends in themselves. The merely is important. What about that? It certainly sounds better, and it certainly seems to make sense out of the false promising case in a kind of intuitive way. What's wrong with false promising, one wants to say? Not that you couldn't at the same time will your maxim as a universal law. This seems a bit strained, although on the Kantian view it's true. One wants to say, no, what's wrong is that you're treating the person you're lying to as a mere means to your end rather than as an end in themselves. All right, it does sound better, but I don't think it's very adequate for two reasons, or two kinds of reasons. First, there is the transactional context. There are many cases where we do treat people as means to our ends. You know, I call up a plumber to fix the leak in my sink, and he comes up and fixes the leak and seeks to talk to me about politics or philosophy, and I'm disinterested and I just wish to pay him and send him on his way. I might be a bit brusque, but I haven't done anything immoral. Have I violated the categorical imperative? No, one wants to say, because I haven't treated him merely as a means. Why? Because he's consented. That's the standard line. You might want to say, well, look, insofar as he comes and consents to this fundamental exchange of services for money, I am still treating him as an autonomous agent. And I think that's right. But if we think that consent, as it were, is a solvent that dissolves any difficulty in the subsequent interaction, we turn Kant into an extreme libertarian. You know, if two people agree to fight each other to the death in gladiatorial combat for prize money, does the fact that each has freely consented mean there's no moral objection, that each is treating each other as ends in themselves because they acknowledge their, autonomy? Is this the position that we're going to ascribe to Kant, turning Kant into a libertarian? So long as there's consent, there's no violation of the second formulation. That's one problem. And the other is, in some cases, there won't be consent. I am treating you as a means to my end, and yet I haven't done anything wrong. Consider the following example. I look out of my window. I see somebody go by. I think they have an interesting profile, and I draw it. I've treated you as a means to my end. I haven't gotten your consent, but I haven't done anything wrong. Why? Because I haven't harmed you. And we're assuming I don't then use your profile in some ad, or I don't display the painting anywhere and get some unacknowledged wealth or benefit. I just enjoyed drawing it. I used your profile as a means to my end, but because I haven't harmed you, I don't think anybody, outside of the fussiest moralist, would say I've done anything wrong. There might be lots of examples where this, a comedian might enjoy some accent they overhear on the subway and use it in some sketch they use years later. There's no harm, there's no wrong. But Kant's categorical imperative test is blind to worries about benefit and harm and welfare. And this seems to me to be the recurring problem in both these formulations and in all these criticisms. Though I should add, the normative language in the maxim problem is a separate problem, quite apart from this worry about welfare and benefit. The normative language in the maxim problem is a problem about treating our intentions as if they don't have normative content from the start. This seems to me a kind of, in a way, deeper error. It just seems obvious to me that morality is with us, or moral worry is with us, from the beginning when we're formulating our intentions, and the justification for our intentions is kind of woven into how we describe them from the beginning. But okay, I'm going to wrap this up. Those are the problems I wish to bring to your attention. The first formulation, I think, is insufficiently sensitive to worries about benefit or harm, and as such, all kinds of maxims can pass that would be otherwise objectionable. And we also have the problem with normative justification in the maxim. And the second formulation, I think, either turns Kant into a libertarian or is insensitive to these cases where we do treat people as means but fail to harm them. And that, I think, is all I have to say about the categorical imperative test.